Hello everybody, and thank you very much for coming to this policy exchange event on police and crime commissioners. First year, almost the first year of police and crime commissioners in action. The elections took place last November, and it's been a interesting and I suspect difficult first year for the policy. Turnout was quite low in the elections, very probably because of when they were held, and there has been a focus from the national media on the sort of more negative aspects of the policy, in terms of stories about who's been claiming what for expenses and who's been paying their own sort of political friends to get the jobs. But I did have a look before I came about sort of on the local papers, and actually there's been some very positive things done and sort of quite positive coverage, and it seems like the PCCs have been getting stuck in and making some pretty difficult and quite interesting decisions. So what we're here to talk about is how it's gone and how PCCs can improve going forward, and I think perhaps most interestingly how we get the public more interested in this policy, so hopefully in the next PCC elections we might be looking at a turnout that's perhaps twice as big as the one we got last time. So we have sort of set questions from our hosts, which each of the panellists is going to talk about for 5 minutes or so, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. So first off is going to be the minister who's now in charge of police and crime commissioners, Damian Green, and I think what will be quite interesting is to hear the issue of localism in particular, and the idea of whether or not the Home Office is genuinely leaving PCCs to get on and do what they really want to do, and also on the issue of whether or not the target culture, which has been a big issue for this government, getting rid of it, whether or not that perhaps is creeping back in locally. So, Damian.
Thank you, James. I'll say what I want to say, then I'll answer the questions you want me to answer in time and passion. Maybe. First of all, congratulations to Policy Exchange. It is the fact that we're at their event. It is worth pointing out how rare it is for a policy to be advocated so strongly by a think tank and slide into the public realm and actually be enacted relatively quickly. I mean, it normally takes decades. And I think it's a sort of model for all think tanks to operate. On the localism, it is, I think the advent of PCCs has big significance in two ways. The first as a very significant step forward to the wider localism agenda. And if you remember, the first flush of this was meant to be mayors in big cities, and rather surprisingly, I think rather disappointingly, that hasn't taken off. We've had a referendum in places that have turned down the prospect of having a mayor. I can't understand why, but people have. Whereas the PCCs happen all over the country, and therefore it gives people something new in an area that people care about, policing, that they now have somebody local they can hold to account. And for all, I mean, I take the point that particularly in national terms, the coverage has inevitably been about the sort of bumps and scrapes and so on, in that's the sea in which all political figures have to swim these days. But actually I think you make a very good point that locally it's undoubtedly true that PCCs have been a huge electric charge to the police governance and the amount by which people care about it. And I'm sure that there are a number of PCCs who were chairs of police authorities beforehand, and it's absolutely the case that in all those areas they are much more public and much more publicly accountable figures as PCCs than they were 2 years ago as chairs of the police authorities. So it has given rise to, I think, a wider appreciation of police governance, despite the low turnout at the election. But the other thing, of course, is that we need to address is the effect on policing, because that's in a sense been one of the main points of it. And all over the country you can find initiatives and successes and different types of thinking which are particularly helpful in that we all know the financial environment in which the whole of the public sector has to live, and that therefore policing to be successful, and it is being successful, has to be more innovative than ever before. And the best examples you find around the country are of innovative chief constables and innovative PCCs working together and sparking ideas off each other. It's not working as well as that everywhere, clearly, but there is now the opportunity to do that. And there are a number of concrete successes to report. I'm sure the two PCCs here can blow their own trumpet, so I won't do them. But John Dwyer in Cheshire has launched a new mobile app that will allow users to report drink drivers or incidents of domestic abuse straight to the police. Matthew Grove in Humberside is going to introduce it's another app, a free app that will enable people to report a crime, including the ability to send in pictures and videos, and he's jumping big time on the technology bandwagon, as well as one of his initial things was to politely inquire why in Humberside they were building a new police headquarters for 8 million, and about a mile down the road a new fire headquarters for about 5 million, and now they're only building one building rather than two, which is a significant advance for Humberside taxpayers. On a similar vein, Adam Simmons in Northamptonshire has in many ways been leading the way in thinking creatively about blue light services. Why do we send 3 different blue light vehicles to a traffic accident and so on? And that's a sort of symbol of an area where, again, thinking ahead, thinking innovatively, why don't we have much greater coordination between fire and police and so on, and isn't the PCC in an ideal position to do that? And we often forget that the first PCC was in London. The Mayor of London is the PCC of London, and actually what's happened there, because the Met's bigger than everywhere else, therefore it's both in a sense more difficult to find a way through and continue to be successful in tough economic times, but also hugely important. And Stephen Greenhalgh, Boris's deputy for policing, has, with the Met themselves, found £500 million worth of savings, while at the same time maintaining officer numbers, starting new recruitment, and actually having more officers out on the streets. You will observe that all the PCCs I praise and aid are Conservative ones. Other parties' PCCs are available, and quietly and privately some of them may have some good ideas as well. If I can't be partisan at my own party conference, when can I be? So all over the country you see good ideas coming forward. It seems to me that there are 4 big challenges ahead. The first of which is to make permanent the legitimacy of PCCs by demonstrating the difference being made. And I mean, to answer directly one of your points, James, the Home Office does try very hard not to dictate. We obviously set overall policing strategy, but just as never, or one hopes the Home Office never interferes in operational policing, so we are determined to let the PCCs write their own crime plans, and as long as it's legal, they can do it. And if they want to try and reintroduce target culture, we strongly urge them not to. We think that's the wrong way to have policing going, and we'll have that argument with them publicly if they want to do that. I think the second big challenge is to show that collaboration with the private sector, with other forces, and with other agencies of the public sector is not inhibited by the advent of PCCs, which many people said it would be. I haven't observed that happening in many places. It has in some places, but not in many places, because sensible PCCs realise that that kind of collaboration is good for their force. I think the looking for other responsibilities, looking for what you can do in terms of the delivery of emergency services in particular, is a next step that PCCs will be sensible to look at. And the fourth and final challenge, I think, is to establish transparency as an absolute key to everything, and not least in answering the question of what is the sort of role of the Home Office and the Policing Minister and so on in this new landscape. We are absolutely determined, and it's the sort of thing we can only do through central government powers, to make sure that having more information about what's happening, both in terms of crime prevention, of crime fighting, and of expenses and all that kind of thing, is available online, is available in ways that people can compare and contrast, because that means that the system itself then stops being, in the old-fashioned way, responsible to the police minister or the Home Secretary, and actually becomes responsible to the public, the people who are paying their taxes so that their streets are kept safe by the police. That's the very radical transformation that this is a very key part of. And so, as I say, my final thought is that for all the bumps and scrapes along the way, I think this is a hugely successful reform. And I think it's to the huge credit of everyone involved, the PCCs and also the police service itself, that with everything else going on and all the amount of change that there is in the system, that crime has continued to fall fairly consistently. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next we're going to go to Julia, who sat next to me in this very room, I think, this time last year as a candidate, and was successful in North Yorkshire, and very glad to see her here. She has, I think, fair to say, proved herself in an admirable way, a hard woman to please, re-advertising for a chief constable job when no one took her fancy the first time around, and also the things she said last year I remember very clearly were about how she wanted to make the police more responsive to socially vulnerable people and stop the amount of time that people who are have mental health needs was spending in cells, and I think you've done that actually, and you've set up a special unit, I think, for dealing with them. So, if we could have your thoughts on your first year, and how you think going forward you can, we can make the job more engaged with the public.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and thank you everybody for coming tonight. I think it has been an absolutely fascinating first year, and Debbie's quite right in saying I had to find a new chief constable, and the first time I advertised the job I had a handful of applicants come forward, and the second time when people realised I was serious about getting a new chief constable I had a whole range of applicants come forward, which was quite an interesting process, and I bucked the trend a little bit by appointing an assistant chief constable who hadn't been a deputy but had come outside of the force, and I have to say we have developed a really good, strong, collaborative way of working that that really is starting to generate ideas and innovation from the ground up for our force. And so I really want to talk a little bit about some of those innovations that we're looking at, rather than actually sort of police governance, because I think the first thing we all had to do was sort of put in place basic governance arrangements, and we've all done that, I think, probably in our own ways with our own chiefs, to look at the issues in our own local forces. And I have, so Hugh probably thinks I was probably one of the outliers in the way that we've approached things. But for me, it's all about really knowing what's going on in your local police service. And I felt, when I came into the role, that the old system was far too arm's length, far too report-based. It was the ACC, then ACC, told me, well, the problem with the performance scrutiny is by the time we get to the police and the police authority, the statistics are out of date. We've dealt with the problem and we've moved on. So we really have to find a different way of doing that. And the model we've got now in North Yorkshire is what I call scrutiny from the inside rather than scrutiny from the outside. And the chief and I work together to identify where the risks are in the organisation and deal with them. We have, like all police services, a serious challenge around the finances. So we have a sort of church roof fund that we have identified particular areas within the service that we think we can achieve savings from. And this comes on top of a programme before I started where they'd made 19% of police staff redundant. And so, you know, the quick wins have already been won, and we really now need to start to innovate around where we get these savings from. And if I go down the list of the church roof fund, the vast majority of those savings will come from collaboration. So they'll either come from collaboration with other police forces, and we've completely restructured the way that regional policing is operating in Yorkshire and Humber. They will come from collaborations with other blue light services, for example, fire and rescue, and we're in advanced discussions with fire and rescue around how we collaborate more effectively, which includes a shared HQ in about 2016. And we're also looking at how we might create what we call a third entity, which will provide shared services to a number of local authorities, the fire and rescue, the police, and the Office of Police and Crime Commissioner, as a sort of shared back office function. And if we can start to deliver those sort of innovations, then we really start to drive through efficiencies and improve the service that we're trying to deliver. The other thing that is also really important is how, as PCCs, we have the sort of helicopter view, the bird's eye view of what's going on in our local areas. And we have relatively few formal powers in terms of collaborating with local authorities in the criminal justice system. But what we do have is our commissioning clout, because we have money that our partners want. And we also have the powers of persuasion as elected individuals to actually go and talk to other leaders in our local area. And so we're really starting to develop some interesting partnerships. So I was at a meeting last week with the University of York where sat around the table was the clinical commissioning group, public health from one of the local authorities, and some of the service providers for mental health services in North Yorkshire. And we were discussing actually how we understand between all of those people providing services the costs and the failures in service to people with mental health problems, not just, you know, in terms of the police picking up the pieces and dealing with them through the obvious channels like under the Mental Health Act, but actually the broader implications of us working together to pool our resources, to commission jointly services that will actually reduce demand both on the police service and across our local partners. And I think it's that area for me that is really exciting about the role of the Police and Crime Commissioner. And I think if we can use our commissioning sensibly and base it on evidence and gather and persuade people around that evidence of need amongst our most vulnerable people, we can really start to make a difference in shaping new services and different services that prevent demand both for the police service and for other services. And we've got a pilot going on in, it's a really good example, a pilot going on in A&E in Scarborough at the moment, where we've got an alcohol worker in A&E, and we've done the sums around how much money it's saving for the health service. We're now doing the sums around actually how much it's saving for the police, and the reductions in crime and antisocial behaviour that those interventions are starting to deliver. And it's no surprise that of the frequent flyers, the 48 frequent flyers that come into A&E, 47 of them are known to the criminal justice system. And if we can start to work together on issues like this, then I think that this role of Police and Crime Commissioner, beyond the policing side of it, is actually really exciting and can start to deliver some significant changes in our local communities.
Thank you very much. And next we have Christopher, who I think is a man ahead of the game. The big announcement of the week from the Justice Secretary was an end to caution culture. I think you got that admirably first. You inherited a force which was 47% all crimes punished with caution.
Yes, we're the highest user.
Extraordinary figure, and you've told the police to use them less. I wonder how that's going. I also wonder how the police perceive it.
Well, I haven't, just to be very clear and to reassure Sir Hugh, I haven't told them to use them less. I've asked them...
Minister, I'm being picked on.
I've asked the doughty guardian of operational independence of the movement. I haven't asked them to do less, but I have questioned why they're being used, the way they were being used. And this came about because we are the highest user of cautions. There are some very legitimate reasons why that might be the case. We're the most rural police force in England and Wales. The types of crime that we particularly deal with, the distances involved and all that kind of thing, are all sorts of reasons within that why we might be a higher user than might otherwise be expected. But there was some concern in my mind as to why this was the case, and it was connected to another observation I had of the force, which was that it was extraordinarily focused on figures and detection rates, particularly for its sort of measures of success, and that there was conceivably a connection between the two. The outcome, when the Justice Secretary announced a review of this back in April, it was actually something that my Chief Constable, who I just appointed, and I had been discussing beforehand, and I said to him, you know, what do you think is behind this? And he expressed some concern about how this was being managed. Anyway, I went and said so to the BBC, which caused a certain amount of nervousness and, you know, what's going on here, but we needed to reassure ourselves that they were being used appropriately for the right types of crimes, not excessively in terms of the number of times a person got cautions. It now turns out that there are some issues with how the processes work within the force, and it might in fact be encouraging more wider use of them than there should be, and that is something the Chief Constable assured me last week that he is looking at in some detail. A couple of points about that, just to sort of step back on the wider role and function of PCCs, actually. And our job, if you like, as guardians of the police and criminal justice system within our areas. Because in making that announcement, I certainly upset quite a lot of people within the force who felt that this was something they knew how it worked and what the hell was I doing getting involved in their stuff. One of the organisations first to come out on the back of my comments to the press was Welsh Women's Aid, who were deeply concerned that domestic violence, for example, was not being reported because people felt that it wasn't dealt with when it was reported. And my point to those critics of mine within the police at the time was that my raising this is not about attacking what you're doing. My raising this is about the fact that the public know there is a problem, and if you don't bring it out in the open, if you don't discuss it, and you don't address it, then you don't help solve that problem. And actually there's a real value that police and crime commissioners can have in our role as guardians of confidence in this system, that just the simple fact of my saying it in public contributed to. And obviously there's a lot more work to be done around that particular issue, and it is ongoing, but it was striking to me as the first time I'd done it, just how important that part of it was. And if I can sort of stray a little bit into the sort of wider roles of the Police and Crime Commission, which you has talked about, some of the commissioning powers and our ability to look across the criminal justice system. It is so important in this system, this question of confidence, and it's like sort of fairies. You know, if you don't believe in it, it doesn't exist. The public have to believe in justice, and they have to be confident that when crimes are committed, that the punishment that's meted out fits the crime. And we definitely have a role, if you like, in looking across the system and seeing where that maybe not necessarily the case. And I think that's a really important part of what we can do as police and crime commissioners. And the reason we can do that is largely by power of this direct accountability that we have, that we're a public figure that everybody can identify. And you know, the downside of that is if there's only one person to blame if it goes wrong. The plus side is that it's very clear who is responsible, and there's a pressure on us to deliver. And that is useful for all sorts of reasons, not least it makes the service more public focused. It makes it very locally focused. Again, our big challenge actually at WPAS is not crime or its volume, but it's geography, and how do you provide a policing service across a huge area. And that's just as valid a professional challenge for officers as the problem of tackling, you know, gang crime in Manchester or wherever it happens to be. But it's just a different challenge, and because the service has been focused on the numbers so much, it's tended to overvalue the crime and undervalue the people. I think it's a great opportunity for innovation. We can, in our case, explore responses to rural crime and rural policing, and we're looking at that deliberately. We want to be the country's leading force for rural policing because that's our big challenge. We're going
Yeah,
to compete with North
each
Yorkshire
other.
on it. So they will be coming to us for yet more advice. And I think you can do a great deal locally, again, about joining up, not just the justice system, but also with local authorities and other parts of public sector in our areas, because after all, we are serving the same customers, as it were. And again, my challenge is in a geographically dispersed area, the only way you get an economy of scale in delivering services and saving money is by looking to other people who are serving the same customers in the same area. We can't collaborate with front desks with South Wales because South Wales' front desks are in South Wales, self-evidently. But we could, for example, with local councils, and I think that's an avenue that hasn't really been explored in the old system, and it's one that we're pursuing with some vigour as I speak.
Thank you very much. And finally, we're going to go to Max. And as Damian's already said, Policy Exchange created this policy essentially in London, and they've stuck with it, and they've been the most passionate advocate of it through all the brickbats over the last 5-6 years. It was in development, and I think what Max is focused on is where we go from here. How we not just sort of cement what we have, but how we can improve on it. And I think you've got interesting ideas in terms of PCCs, not just dealing with the police service, but also dealing with perhaps the prison service and the probation service, and bringing the whole thing together as a justice commission, essentially. So, James.
Yeah, so as the Minister said, we have a Policy Exchange have quite a long-standing connection to the reform. For that reason, it's great to be here with two of its pioneers, and also it means that we retain a real interest in how it's working on the ground. And I just wanted to say, from our perspective, I think it's also important to recognise that the sky hasn't fallen. So there was a time when the opponents of the creation of police and crime commissioners talked about politicisation of policing and the corruption of operational independence, and ultimately the destruction of the British policing model. And actually, I think the first 10 months has proved that that's not been the case. To such an extent, we held a fringe event in Brighton last week with the Shadow Policing Minister, David Hanson, and he said on PCCs we've got three options. One is to keep them as they are, one is to slightly tweak the scrutiny function, and the third is to go further and look at the criminal justice angle and extending the powers. So there wasn't an option there to scrap, and I think that just shows that once you let the democratic genie out of the bottle, it's very difficult to put it back in. And it also shows you that people in the policing world are actually a lot more positive about the reforms now than perhaps they were in the run-up to the legislation being passed. All of that aside, it's not, that's not to say there haven't been some real problems, as James highlighted, around expenses, around certain aspects of personnel, and also some quite high-profile disagreements, shall we say, between certain chiefs and certain PCCs. And all of that has contributed to a national narrative that is quite negative still, and understandably so. But I think my perspective is that will change, and it will change over time and start to match what locally is already a much more positive narrative at the local level. And it will change, first of all, by PCC simply doing a good job over the next 3 years, but also by them being a bit more, over time, a bit more vocal nationally about their achievements once those achievements have started to be more prominent, and once their changes and their innovations have started to properly bed in and bear fruit. As Chris and Julia and the Minister have talked about, there have been real examples all over the country of good practice and innovation. Matthew Ellis, I think, is in the audience, was highlighted today by the Home Secretary, talking about his progress on mental health. I was on a panel with Vera Baird last week, who as a Labour PCC is making great strides on violence against women and girls and alcohol abuse. So there are these examples all over the country that I think are primarily driven by the clarity of leadership that PCCs are able to bring to the role, as opposed to a committee, the police authorities that preceded them. But at Policy Exchange, we're already thinking about the future. So we're trying to try and sketch out how this reform should develop in the sort of medium to long term. So we published a report a few months ago called Power Down, which, as the title suggests, is focused on how in areas like criminal justice, early intervention, problem families, fire and ambulance services, how PCCs might be given more formal roles in those areas, because I think everybody has said this on the panel, but we see the real potential for this role in being able to integrate those local services at that local level, both to cut costs, but also to make sure that in brokering deals locally, pooling budgets, and trying to ensure a kind of laser focus on key issues, whatever those might be in the local area. That's where we see this reform as having the most potential, and that's how, from our perspective, you can make a reality of the and crime bit of the job.
Thank you very much. Well, everyone's running exactly to their 7 minutes, so we have got half an hour for questions. I'm going to abuse my position slightly, if I may, although you should feel free to decline by asking a question from here to the audience. But I wonder if Hugh or you were. I mean, I was, I've been in briefings with you, and you were a ferocious critic before this policy came into force. And I just wonder if you could tell us how you think it's gone in practice. Has it been as bad as you thought it might be, or has it been?
Well, I have no idea where I was a ferocious. I can do ferocious. I've never been ferocious.
I was sat with you, and I would.
Around this, I raised a number of issues, and if one looks at the initial draft and what we ended up with through some very sensible conversations around, the strategic policing requirement, the protocol, the oath of independence, I think, what emerged was not what the initial start was. So let's just be a bit clear. I've also said very plainly, I'll repeat it just for the sake of absolute clarity, how the police are held to account. It's a matter for government, not a matter for police. The issue is, how is it working? And we're all, my slight concern at the moment is we're all going to violently agree with each other in this room. Reform was far more fun earlier, Julia, I have to say. We had, Christmas there, we had a bit more of quite a sharp edge to the debate, which I think was really useful. A number of things spring to mind from what the panel have said. I don't disagree with any of it. And Julie, I think you have to be congratulated for re-advertising. If I have a concern, and not because of the individuals, if I have a slight concern at the moment, something we need to watch, or the APCC needs to watch, is the number of single officer competitions for chief constable. That's not healthy at a number of levels, but then you have to look at 1960, why did we have a 62-role commission? Question mark. One of it was around this relationship getting too comfortable. And there are now people who have been in force, bottom to top. Again, not a reflection on the individuals, the sharing of best practice, the experience. I'd be delighted to come and work for you, Chris. I have substantial experience of rural policing in Northern Ireland. I don't think I didn't apply. I wasn't too optimistic about my success levels. But I think there is something about sharing experience. And you've chosen someone. Yes, he's only an ACC, but he's an ACC with experience in Greater Manchester, and he worked for me in Northern Ireland. Those are big forces with lots of experience. So I just think it's something we just need to look at. Because I just don't think that's healthy. And chiefs need to be clear at the same level that they don't do the same now. They are responsible solely, albeit they'd be potty not to speak to PCCs about it, about their senior command team.
Well, we've got an ACC now coming from Cumbria as well, so we've got,
exactly.
We needed some new blood.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think that's healthy. It's always been healthy, but the checks and balances, which a minister would well understand we used to have gone, so it's something you just need to watch. I never thought you was an outlier, Julie. I think that's where the innovation is, around the edges of this and challenging us, and we want to be challenged. An issue raised by a colleague in the previous one, it was Chatham House Rules, but in general terms there was an issue around, are we being properly held to account? And I think it's mixed across the country. I think some are more forensic than others, but we would all applaud and again violently agree that please, the numbers game, we all need numbers to operate, but target-driven cultures we know don't work. So I have no particular difficulty with that. I think a big strength of this system, Max, in a way, is the and crime bit. It's the banging heads bit at the local level. On mental health with substantial top cover, I have to say, from a Home Sec in pushing those edges, but we have to get a more joined up approach. What's interesting about the bill, and we were not influential in this part of the bill, and it strikes me quite strange, forensic almost detail on the police bit, very little on the and crime bit. Now that strikes me as silos at the top, sort of saying, keep out a bit. And that's where PCCs locally have to drive that agenda, because that's where the savings are, frankly. A final point, as you put me on the spot, the one bit I do think we need to face up to, and this is my broken record speech, and I've had this conversation with the last government and this government, we are still trying to deliver policing with a 20th century model that was invented before colour television against 21st century threats, many of which were national, and the PCCs haven't touched really on the national. So my challenge back in a way is, how do we organise, we had this conversation just now, so I don't want to repeat it, but how do we organise nationally that gives, you know, how do we mobilise as 44 forces, I always include Northern Ireland, it's an affection of mine, in the national agenda to make sure we maximise the efficiencies of scale, but I don't think in reality we're going to change the structure of policing.
Thank you, and thank you for being the sort of fifth member of the
Well, you asked me.
No, I did wasn't. No, I did.
Well, you didn't ask me, actually.
No, thank you. I've been silly of me not to ask you when you were sitting there. Right, so if we can, if I can go to the audience, if you can just say who you are and where you're from, and who in particular you'd like to answer the question. Yes.
Hello, Jean Smith Rushcliffe. I've been a magistrate for 32 years, and I can tell you that my colleagues in Nottingham, which was one of the largest benches in the country at one time, they've slimmed down somewhat now, are very concerned about the cautioning process. We have 24 courts in Nottingham, and we are regularly averaging, I should think, 6 or 7 courts. We've gone from daily, twice daily courts for youth crime to once on Monday, Wednesday and Friday. Now, nobody is of the opinion that crime has decreased to that degree, and I have been told anecdotes by the chairman, well, the deputy chairman of our bench, that, I was told on Friday, the district judge at Nottingham Magistrates Court was told the prosecutor to go back and speak to the CPS, to her boss, because the defendant before them was charged with common assault, and the district judge felt he should have had threats to kill because he put a pillow over his partner's face and held a knife to her throat. Now that isn't common assault in my book, and I don't think it is in many other people's books. There are countless other things, cautions for rape and for armed robbery and all the rest of it. And they are very concerned about it. And I understand locally that police are absolutely overwhelmed with work as well. So I don't think it's doing the morale of the police any good when they're catching people and the CPS are saying, do this, do that, and let them go.
Is it something that the PCC Nottingham has talked about? Is it, we raised it with him?
I haven't had a chance to speak to him, to be honest. Whenever he's come locally, I've been at council meetings or something, so I haven't spoken to him there. But I rather imagine that the bench chairman will have done.
As you say, it's not, you don't direct, but if you talk about the issue, then the message gets through.
Yeah, the first thing was talking about, and actually magistrates have been voicing the concerns that you're voicing in our area as well. Where we are at the moment is that, as part of the Chief Constable assuring himself about how his internal scrutiny, if you like, we are putting together an independent panel to review our use of cautions, which will include magistrates. Or representatives of the magistrates, in order to get that degree of external assurance, and looking ahead where we see, broadly speaking, we see, don't we all, an increased role for communities, forms of community out-of-court disposals, community justice, if you like, which I think is a very powerful and positive direction. But for that to deliver, it has to have confidence, and there's also, in my view, a role for magistrates in providing some assurance to those processes as they start to develop, and we develop restorative justice processes, that if cases aren't coming to magistrates in their courts, they've obviously got an interest in crime and they know their areas and so on, there could be a role for them as individuals in providing scrutiny to those out-of-court disposals that we expect to be using more and more of. And we're looking at ways, this panel is looking at what we've done so far, but it will no doubt form the basis of some plans we have going forward to provide robustness to that process.
I'll just go to Damian from that. The plans that yourself and the Justice Secretary outlined yesterday, how much difference will they make in the case that's suggested here, where, as you say, it sounds very much like almost attempted murder, and it's been charged as common assault, presumably, because burden of evidence is lower.
We announced two separate things yesterday, which I think may have got slightly sort of confused in a wash. One was the restriction of the ability to use simple cautions for particularly serious offences, but the other is, and as it were, we've done the consultation on that, and that's the conclusion we've come to. But also now we're starting a wider consultation on out-of-court disposals more generally, so precisely to see whether in some cases they are being used inappropriately, whether the whole landscape of out-of-court disposals is just too complex for anyone to deal with sensibly. You know, there are out-of-court disposals that people in this room won't have ever heard of, and that there may well be sort of coppers on the beat who don't quite know what the difference is between this, that and the other. So it's no sort of sensible way to take decisions. So we're taking the lid off everything and saying let's look at the whole landscape. And separately, and I very much want to like something Chris just said about whether in what is a relatively new and really quite interesting territory of how we can best use restorative justice, community resolution, whatever you want to call it, what role can magistrates play in that? Because we have this wealth of expertise around the place, which has in the past only ever been used in courtrooms. If we're trying to do better out-of-court disposals, then actually having that free expertise, which we'll thank you hugely, let's see how that can best be used in that context as well.
How would that work? It's interesting, but how could a magistrate, you know, let's say, a sort of classic example of a Friday night in the town centre, and lots of penalty notices sort of handed out for drunkenness. How could you involve a magistrate in that?
Well, I think, I'm not thinking about individual ones. I mean, as I say, we're at the start of a consultation, so all of this has to be hedged around without. We haven't come to any decision yet. We haven't heard back from people yet. But it seems to me there is certainly a strategic role for magistrates to have, saying what you need is clarity, and these are the sort of things you ought to be doing. This is how you should take a decision about this case as opposed to that case. So be quite engaged in setting the ground rules.
So they can sort of audit, I don't know, 50 penalty notices that were handed out by police, and a senior magistrate could look at them and say, actually, I don't think that and that were suitable for penalty notices. They should have come before me. Is that the sort of thing you do?
Yeah, that's one of the things, but also I think hopefully setting out in advance. But as I say, we're at the beginning of the consultation process, so let's hear not least from magistrates themselves about how they would
Just
want
add 2 comments to that.
Yeah, please.
Please don't forget the victims, and please can somebody look at the CPS, because there's serious thoughts that they are undercharging to save money.
Yeah. Can I just look in a little bit here? I mean, I this is something that I identified quite a while ago as well, and actually it was the magistrate. All 5 chairs of the bench came to my office to raise this with me about 6 months ago. So it's something clearly that magistrates are very concerned around. And I spent a morning in the unit that monitors sexual offenders. And actually, even in that unit, I found examples of particularly young people who've been given cautions who shouldn't have been given cautions. So there is a real issue here. The public are right to be concerned about it. I think one of the things that we're doing with the panel that we're setting up is we're actually having victims on it, so they will have a voice on it. And we're going to look at it in terms of themes. So we're going to look at different types of crimes, and we're going to sort of theme it as we go. So we allow people not just to sort of dip sample, but really actually to get behind some of the issues that we think are happening going on. And it's been an interesting process with the police service trying to set that up, because they instinctively want to sort of corporatise it through the LCJB, the Local Criminal Justice Board, and actually it needs to be much more nimble than that, and less corporate than that, and more victim and people focused than that. And I think I think we are moving towards that in quite a healthy way now.
Thank you, Anna. Great question.
Yeah, I was wondering what the PCC thought about the idea of them having complete control over Chief Constable's pay and other perks, and about Chief Constables having complete control over all other officers' pay and perks. So whether the PCCs think it's a good idea, and whether the Minister would be prepared to localise that.
Not a good idea. Too many. There has to be a national system, and it has to be absolutely transparent. And there are too many anomalies locally, and the whole thing needs to be looked at properly. It is a real issue, and it needs to be looked at properly. And I know, for example, SUPOSA, which is the union for senior police officers, they want this resolved nationally as well, and we have to do it. There are a whole range of things lurking in the background that are going to emerge that are quite difficult and quite tricky, and this absolutely has to be gripped at a national level.
What do you think, Matt?
Policy change gets in trouble whenever we talk about
Yeah,
police
that's why I
bail.
asked. Yeah.
I think we'd have to look at it. We haven't looked at it before, so I'm not quite sure what our line would be. But I mean, in general, we've said before in the public sector that that local pay bargaining and local pay arrangements, that there are significant advantages to that. But I think we'd have to go and look at the policing context more particularly.
I'm not sure if I quite necessarily question the answer I understood either entirely. I think there is a scope for. Do you mean in terms of controlling it that we should have complete freedom over what a chief constable's salary is, or any freedom?
Complete.
I think complete would be probably a step too far. What I do value though is a degree of latitude, which is what we currently have, plus or minus 10% around a spot rate. But I do agree with Julia. There's an awful. I mean, that's part of it. There's a whole load of stuff behind it that we're all kind of picking through. I mean, I turned up to my force to find that there were routine 7.5% bonuses for staying in your job for a year that had been signed through by the police authority in the past. Needless to say, they don't exist anymore. But that was the sort of stuff that had happened for all sorts of reasons, which I won't bore you with. But I do think there is value in us having a degree of local flexibility in that plus or minus 10%. I would say that wouldn't I, because I went down from the spot rate. Luckily my chief constable's not here to say that he'd like it the other way. But actually, given that we're living in a very low, frankly, £120,000 salary a year, which is what he's on, is a lot of money in West Wales. It's not a rich part of the world. There are people there. It almost qualifies for Objective 1 status for those Europhiles in the room, which means you get extra money for being underdeveloped. That's a lot of money, and I think I have no problems, if you like, making the case that it should be lower than what the spot rate was. So I do think there is space for local flexibility. I do also think we need to look across the board at what some of the perks and so on that have been built into the system over time are, and maybe strip some of them out.
And some of the sort of manipulation of local legal, there's been a lot of interpretation of the law locally to allow the police authorities to do what they wanted to do, and it really needs tidying up.
I'm Adam Pemberton, I'm from Charity Victims Support, so I'd like to ask the two PCCs a question, I guess. In year 2, one of the things you'll have to do is commission services to support victims of crime, and I guess I'd be interested to know what you've learnt in year 1 that will inform how you go about that, and in particular, I guess, preserving what's good currently, as well as recognising where there's gaps and there's more to do.
I'm really excited about being able to commission victim services locally. I think it is a major opportunity for police and crime commissioners, and I think that too many victims fall through the cracks at the moment. I also think that a person doesn't want to be a victim, and I think the mere fact that they have to be sort of referred externally and they have to tell their story many times, that is a very difficult journey for victims, and I think the support for victims needs to be when the victim needs it, where the victim needs it, and I think it needs to be. I think being able to commission those services locally is vitally important. And if you look at the way that the police service supports victims, it's process led. It is not about the victims. And when you talk to victims, when they've had a fantastic service from a police officer, who's really, really looked after them, that's when you get fantastic service. That's when victims are satisfied. And they want, but they want it when they want it, not when the process and the system tells them. And so I think it needs to be much more victim focused, and I think it needs to be less distant. And I have an issue with a sort of third party from on high supplying it. I think victim support, for example, could provide local services, but I think it needs to be closer to the victims and less distant from the victims.
Yeah, I mean, what have I learned is just how important it is, and I echo really what Julia has said, and how often this is the truism that a criminal chooses to commit crime, but a victim doesn't choose to become a victim, and yet the system doesn't seem to make any distinction at all. And because of the nature of it, you just become a number very quickly and totally sort of unresponsive. So that's what I learned. In terms of the approach forward, I echo Julia's point really. I think it is about being able to respond locally, and to do that, I think being able to commission locally as part of our powers will be extremely powerful. I think lots of what Victim Support does very well, and I'm going to go into sort of commercial negotiations now, but I think we need to look for a service, as Julia says, that is more locally focused. Again, my big challenge is the rurality, and quite often the best provider won't be known to anybody except the people who live on that particular street. There happens to be a local church group or whatever who are willing to offer support. We've actually had this recently with April Jones's family in Hunter. You know about the case that the best support we can find actually is just down the road, the local church group. But we only know about them because the local PCSOs knew about them, and that's how we got them involved. Victim Support or any other organisation national would find it very difficult to get to that level of localism, and that's the challenge for the providers of victim services, is to get that degree of localism.
Can I just add to that, Jen? Just the observation that at the time this was being proposed, it was the subject of almost more ferocious lobbying against, mostly by victims of
I know.
than almost anything else in the legislation, that this was going to be the end of victim services, and how these new people, how can you trust them? And I suspect and hope that what we'll find is that the enthusiasm for it that both Julia and Chris have shown is reflected across the PCC world. And also, this will be a classic example where somebody somewhere will have a good idea that everyone else will leap on. Whereas with the best will in the world, a nationally led contract is just less likely to do that, because everyone tries to do their best. But when you've got lots of different people with lots of different issues about rurality or certainly in the inner cities, the difficulty of accessing victims sometimes, doing it differently around the country, I'm sure we'll end up with better services to victims.
Yes,
yes, I've got a question. I'm Councillor Debbie Mason, and unfortunately our Police and Crime Commissioner is Paddy Tipping, Labour. So we have different issues. I'm on the scrutiny panel. Most of the time that he is spent is going around, shaking people's hands, telling everybody what a good job he does. I'm sure he does work in between, but he is a very slippery character, and he's telling everybody that he has made 150 new officers. What he forgets to tell them that actually 300 have been made redundant and taken early retirement. From our panel and from the scrutiny side, we've tried to have a look at what publicity the scrutiny process should have. And as it's a Labour chairman, mostly Labour councillors that are on it, they've decided, they don't want to do too much scrutiny. And I was just wondering, from the political side, it's quite hard then, at the end of the term, and our role in actually publicity, the things that he's not doing. How would you sort of face that challenge, if you like, over somebody who is quite well known in Nottinghamshire, he's ex-MP, and I'd just like your views on the scrutiny process. He does bring along the Chief Constable with him. We're supposed to scrutinise him, not the Chief Constable. And sometimes if he gets a tricky question, he turns to his friend, because if I was a member of the public looking at it, it's all first name terms. And Paddy sits there and calls me Debbie, and and everybody's supposed to be Paddy, and isn't it wonderful?
I think
How would you say that?
in the interest of fairness, I should say, I used to work for the Nottingham Evening Post, and I thought Paddy Tipping, I knew him, and he was a thoroughly decent chap. So. Right, I will go to Damian, and I'll go to Max if I may.
I think the ultimate answer is about transparency, is actually getting the facts out there, and then arguing a case. And he would no doubt argue he's doing a good job, you might argue he's doing a bad job.
we don't always know because he's very slippery, and there's only me and one other that is actually challenging him because a lot of them are Labour.
That's, I mean, from the sort of national perspective, that's why I think one of the key roles for the Home Office is driving through as much as possible against maybe resistance from bits of the system, wherever it comes from, actually to say that what we want is a lot of information out there about all the relevant things people care about, and in a way in which it can be compared relatively easily from area to area, from force to force, because those are the tools, and if with those tools local politicians want to do a job and say, actually, we're rubbish compared to the people next door at this, why is this particular crime less, well done, all that kind of thing. So I think from the outside, the best thing we can do, and absolutely the best thing we can do for the general public, is to ensure, if necessary through legislation, that people can't just hide behind the sort of one-party state that may exist in some parts of the country.
You shouldn't be, if it's a scrutiny committee, as you suggest, you shouldn't be telling up the Chief Constable, should you? I mean, the PCC should be sufficiently across his brief that he doesn't need the Chief Constable sat next to him.
Well, it's up to the scrutiny committee to say, we're scrutinising you. I mean, there have been, as you know, there's been the opposite row in London, where the equivalent desperately wanted to get the commissioner in front of them, and Stephen Greenhall's quite right. He said, "No, you held me to account. I held him to account." That's
Absolutely.
Have you suggested to him that he shouldn't be bringing the Chief Constable with him?
Well, I have questioned that, and he said, "Oh well, you have to understand it. The chairman of it is actually ex-police authority chairman, and he tries to make it work like a police authority."
There's a lot of police authority members in mourning across the
Yes, there are, and a lot of them in Nottingham.
I think they're everywhere. I've got my chair as the previous police. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we were concerned to highlight in the various reports that we've done over the years on this is to make sure that any scrutiny function doesn't just turn into it isn't a recreation of the police authority by the back door. That is just there to duplicate. So I think the Home Affairs Select Committee are looking at the scrutiny arrangements, and hopefully they'll be reporting around Christmas time, and maybe they'll make some constructive suggestions about the way that scrutiny might be reformed. And I think I'm sure that every PCC and the Minister would be up for looking at that. But I suppose the ultimate answer is if you've got I'm making no comment on paddock tipping, but if an area's got a bad PCC, that's the nature of localism in some respects, and he'll get voted out if it's not doing a good job.
Get to know, and do you feel then that it's up to that scrutiny panel to have their own publicity about what they're doing?
I think if you look in some areas, they are absolutely being very vocal. I mean, if you look at West Yorkshire, there's a former member of the police authority who's a Conservative who has been very critical of the Police and Crime Commissioner. I have an independent on my Police and Crime panel who makes his views very well known. He's an ex-police officer, and it's causing all sorts of bother. But I think you need to sort of stand up and say what you feel and be vocal about it, and actually use the media and say, look, we've got some concerns about this, and be vocal.
I'll just very briefly, does the Evening Post, do they write about the Police and Crime Commissioner? Do they go to these meetings?
No, it's the Evening Post. Well, no, it's the Post.
I mean,
it's not always, I have to say, a Conservative friend, but they print photos of him shaking hands, going to some new children's thing.
But do they attend the meeting? Is there a reporter sat there at the meeting?
No.
Not writing
No.
Is it a public meeting?
It is. We get one guy sometimes who scuttles along,
His dog.
No, luckily he's outside on that.
But you ought to.
Yes,
Banging on their door,
just
they should be
got
there.
this job. I got this portfolio job. I've only attended 2 meetings so far. I was environment before. But but it does give you certain challenges about what you can do over and above the chairman's head of that scrutiny group.
Yeah.
And they are very focused, those, that they do not want necessarily the publicity, and particularly the bad publicity, that there may be over police numbers, over some of the things, you know, that aren't happening. And I just don't like the tenure of the whole thing of the meeting. It looks, if you were at the back there, much too cosy.
Yeah, sure. So,
yeah, just Matthew from Action for Children. Quick question to Julia. You talked about kind of exercising your muscle around commissioning things to prevent crime. I just wonder how far you push that. Whether you would, how far you would exercise that in terms of, say, for example, whether a local authority is commissioning parenting programs to really, properly tackle cycles of neglect, etc. Whether how far you would go down that line to exercise your power.
I think I would go where the evidence took me. Is my answer, and I think that's part of actually what we need to do, is to start gathering and understanding actually what are the drivers of demand and how we can, if it makes financial sense to put money into a programme such as that, because I can demonstrate that it is going to reduce the demand on the police or whatever it is, then it makes sense to look at those sort of things. So I have an open mind on that, but it really does have to be evidence based and not on the sort of whim of a particular police and crime commissioner wanting to sort of do something. And you've got to look at the outcomes that you're going to get from it and whether they're demonstrable. And I think part of the CSP, the community safety landscape, is that a lot of money is just being granted out, and actually trying to demonstrate the outcomes in communities for that money. Well, we haven't been able to do it in North Yorkshire, it just doesn't exist. Well, perhaps with 1 or 2 exceptions.
It's 7 o'clock, but we've got final question, and then we'll wrap up. So.
Thank you. Peter Fowler, Warwickshire, a former member of Warwickshire Police Authority, and I'm not in mourning. I'm now on the Police and Crime Commissioner panel now. But whilst I was on the Police Authority, we actually did collaborate with with West Mercia, and that's working quite well because of economies of scale, and also it's helped us to do the savings that both authorities have had to, or police have had to make. And to Julia, you talked about collaboration. Is that the way you intend to go with yours? And if that's the way, would you actually see merger might be forthcoming, or you might be pushed into merger, as we possibly could be in the future?
Merge of police forces?
Yeah.
I don't think it's necessarily about merging police forces. I think it's about collaborating with your local partners on the ground. Because I think that's where you're really going to get your wins. Yes, we have to collaborate with the police force, particularly around the national issues that Sir Hugh was talking about, so the strategic policing requirement. And we're very clear that our collaboration in the Yorkshire and the Humber is focused on our national requirements. The collaborations locally are with our local partners, where we can work in a more joined up way. So it's different types of collaborations depending upon your objective and what you're trying to do.
Good to stay with, but for the last point, but police mergers are not back on the agenda or anything.
Well, Warwickshire West Mercia is a really interesting point, because the Warwickshire PCC and Chief don't talk about collaboration, they talk about an alliance. They basically see it as one force now. I mean, they've got different badges and they've got different chiefs, but in all other ways, in all the specialist services, it's one force. And they gain benefits from that. And we've always said, I think it's the position has been slightly misinterpreted as being no mergers at all. Our position is that if forces come to us and can demonstrate community support, then absolutely we will look at it.
You won't make them do.
But we're not going to sit there and draw a line and say we're going to have 8 regional forces or whatever. Because the previous government tried that with a majority of 100 and couldn't get it through the House of Commons. So that would be a particularly futile waste of time, frankly, not many else. But nevertheless, one of the interesting things that's happened as the police landscape has changed so radically is that in different parts of the country, this sort of thing has been breaking out. And I think Warwickshire and West Mercia are a really interesting example.
Right, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Thank you to everyone on the panel. Thank you for indulging me in answering my question. And yeah, see you again next year.